Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have returned to talk about a bookshelf essential. We're talking about a bookshelf essential today. Bookshelf Essentials, which is a series of videos that was created by the great David Wiley over at his magnificent channel. You should all go watch David Wiley because he's fantastic. And he created this series of videos, the Bookshelf Essentials, which are basically just books that are essential to our libraries. Books that we would never get rid of because they're so important to us personally. And today, this might seem an unusual choice, but today we're talking about Star Wars. We're talking about Star Wars today. Star Wars, which is of course a series of films and many television shows and cartoons and books and everything else. Star Wars is a big deal. But once, a long, long time ago, Star Wars was just a movie and a book. That was when I was 6 years old in 1977, the film came out. But actually this book, written by Alan Dean Foster, ghostwritten by Alan Dean Foster, it had George Lucas's name on the cover as the author. The book actually came out a little bit before the film did. It had original concept art by Ralph McQuarrie on the cover. And that came out, sold moderately well. But then when the film came out, then it really started to sell, of course, because Star Wars was a phenomenon. Star Wars blew all of our minds when we went to see it in 1977. You know, I don't remember many things from when I was 6, but I remember going to see Star Wars. I remember seeing Star Wars a few times because it was just, there was nothing else like it at the time. And of course, it was a huge hit, and all of us kids who went to watch it became obsessed with all things Star Wars. Unfortunately, there weren't that many things Star Wars at the time, unlike now. You know, there was the movie, there was the book, there's some comics that came out. There was a terrible holiday special that came out, but probably the less said about that, the better. And, you know, then the Star Wars action figures came out. There were those. There were like 5 or 6 of them. You know, there wasn't much, though. But the book, we had the book. And it became important to me because it was probably the second or the third book that I read. First book I read that was like an adult novel was Dracula. And then I think I read Planet of the Apes. And then I read Star Wars. Or I might have read Star Wars before Planet of the Apes. It was a long time ago. Who can remember? But Star Wars certainly was one of the first books I ever read. And it's a really good book, actually. Alan Dean Foster, who wrote the book, is or has become known as the king of movie novelizations because he's just done so many. And he does them well. You know, he's written a bunch of movie novelizations and television novelizations, and as well as his own work, his own original novels and stories. But he's a really good writer, and he knows how to take a film script and make a really good book out of it. And he's done many. You know, he did some Star Trek books. He did a great novelization of the film The Thing. His novelization of The Thing is wonderful. And then he did a really good novelization of the film Alien. And he managed to do that without even knowing what the alien looked like, because no one told him what the alien looked like. But he managed to do it and write a really good book. And his novelization of Star Wars is really good. And he did more Star Wars after this. He did actually the first Star Wars sequel, which was a book called Splinter in the Mind's Eye, which came out, of course, long before Empire Strikes Back did. And George Lucas had it in mind, I think, that if Star Wars wasn't a huge hit, the sequel that he made would be cheaper and would be based on Splinter in the Mind's Eye. But it turns out Star Wars was a mega hit, and he could make a huge movie called Empire Strikes Back. And thank goodness he did, because that's a pretty good movie. As far as my relationship with Star Wars, I like most things Star Wars. I'm not a huge Star Wars mega fan. Thank goodness, because they seem to have troubles. Huge Star Wars fans. It's like the angriest fandom that I've ever come across. But I like most things Star Wars. I like the Star Wars prequels, which I know I'm supposed to hate. But I like them. I enjoyed them. Yes, I see their faults. They have many faults as films, but I like them. I like most of the Star Wars movies. The Last Jedi, there were some things about it I didn't really care for. I didn't particularly care for their portrayal of Luke Skywalker. And the movie was too long. But the only Star Wars movie I actually just can't stand and think is absolutely terrible is The Last Skywalker. Rise of Skywalker. That's what it was called. Rise of Skywalker. That movie sucked. No wonder I can't remember it. It was a terrible movie. I mean, as a movie, it just... Anyway, we're not talking about the movies, though. We're talking about this book, which is an interesting read if you read it now. Of course, I've got it in this hardcover. I wish I had the old mass market paperback that we had when I was a kid. You know, it wasn't just mine. My brother read it. I read it. Everybody read it. And the problem with those mass market paperback novelizations from back in the day is that when they had a movie novelization, they'd put a photo insert inside the book, you know, photos of the movie, which is fantastic, except that if you read a movie novelization mass market paperback more than once, the spine would split right where that photo insert is. I mean, this would always happen, and it, of course, happened immediately to our copy of Star Wars. That thing, man, it got tore up, and it has long since vanished. I wish I had a mass market of that book, though. But I do have this. This is my Barnes & Noble Fancy Pants edition with Darth Vader on the cover and R2-D2 and C-3PO on the back, and some nice end papers that have some original concept art from Ralph McQuarrie. Interesting early concept art of C-3PO and R2-D2. On the back, we've got a scene from Empire Strikes Back, which was not written by Alan Dean Foster for some reason. Probably should have been, but it wasn't. But this has actually the novelizations for the first 3 movies, which were all written by different writers. But the first one, the Star Wars one, is interesting because it was based on a screenplay for a movie that Alan Dean Foster hadn't seen yet. And Star Wars was not a thing. Nothing was known about the Star Wars universe or the characters or anything that did not exist in the original script that Alan Dean Foster was given. And so he had to imagine this world that he knew fairly little about. And George Lucas, you know, he's gone back and forth about saying that he, you know, had the whole thing planned out and then just saying, no, I made it up as I went along. Clearly, he made it up as he went along. At the point when Star Wars was written, he did not know that Darth Vader was Luke Skywalker's father. He didn't know. Nobody knew. He didn't figure that out yet. And so this is just a very interesting early look at the Star Wars universe. And there are some differences which you could spot right away. I mean, in the prologue, it gives you some background for the Star Wars universe, where it's explaining about the Jedi Knights and everything. And we have a couple paragraphs here. Aided and abetted by restless, power-hungry individuals within the government and the massive organs of commerce, the ambitious Senator Palpatine caused himself to be elected President of the Republic. He promised to reunite the disaffected among the people and restore the remembered glory of the Republic. Once secure in office, he declared himself emperor, shutting himself away from the populace. Soon he was controlled by the very assistants and bootlickers that he had appointed to high office, and the cries of the people for justice did not reach his ears. Having exterminated through treachery and deception the Jedi Knights, guardians of justice in the galaxy, the imperial governors and bureaucrats prepared to institute a reign of terror among the disheartened worlds of the galaxy. many used the imperial forces and the name of the increasingly isolated emperor to further their own personal ambitions. Which is interesting, because that doesn't really completely go along with how we think of the emperor, you know, with or how the emperor has been presented in the actual films. He seems more on top of things, the emperor does. But at the same time, yeah, there's some of that going on in the movies as well. And certainly some of that we later saw in the prequels. This was just an early kind of idea about that. And that's how the whole book reads. It's Star Wars, but it's a little different than the Star Wars that we've become accustomed to, which is as you would expect. And so it's like a fascinating little piece of cultural history, the Star Wars novelization. It's a fun book. It's mostly important to me and essential to me just because of the place it held in my life at one time. Nostalgia is not a bad thing. I know it's been used badly. The feeling nostalgia, it's, you know, packaged and sold now, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. And I certainly have fond memories of Star Wars in the early days before it became what it is now. And I'm not overly critical of Star Wars, like I said, but there was something really fantastic about Star Wars when it first came out. And the impact of not just the film, but reading the book over and over again. And I was already a reader by that point. But I think if I hadn't been, it probably would have made me one. And so I have a great affection for this book. I have a great affection for Star Wars. But the book holds an essential part on my bookshelf. And I'm glad I have the Fancy Pants edition. And so that's probably all that I have to say about Star Wars at the moment. Star Wars by Alan Dean Foster. It's a better book than you might expect. Okay, guys, I will catch you next time.